The federal Liberals announced a highly anticipated or perhaps dreaded budget will be coming out on April the 19th. We should see how many billions of dollars have been spent during the pandemic. To discuss this in more detail is Lethbridge MP Rachael Harder joining me from Ottawa. Rachael, billions have been spent, but billions more need to be spent to help businesses survive right now.
Well, hell, that's one opinion. The other one is perhaps we could let industry leaders do what they do best, and that is, of course, put forward creative ideas, be innovative, be entrepreneurial, and roll a profit. As a result of that, of course, it provides jobs and it meets consumer demand, which I think is ultimately really great for our economy and gets the ball rolling again.
So what do you think of all of the money that the Trudeau Liberals have been spending, the taxpayers' dollars so far during the pandemic?
Uh, at first, when the pandemic became a reality, parliamentarians agreed to shutting down Parliament for 2 weeks. I'll note that it's 53 weeks later. And we wanted to give time for the federal government, the Liberals, to come up with a plan and to be able to move forward with that. Unfortunately, we still don't have that plan. But initially, they asked to be able to roll out some money in order to help Canadians who were finding themselves in a really difficult situation. And of course they were in a difficult situation. They were forced to stay home, and lockdowns prevented them from being able to work. And so when the government puts those types of measures in place, of course the government should also make up for that by providing some financial assistance. However, again, it's 53 weeks later and counting. There's still no concrete plan in place in terms of coming out of this pandemic and being able to return back to normal. And I think Canadians are desperate for that.
Yeah, your leader, Aaron O'Toole, wants the government to produce that plan within 20 days to start lifting COVID-19 restrictions, Rachael. That includes reopening the border to the U.S. for non-essential travel. How important is it to reopen that border?
It's certainly about reopening the border, but it's about so much more. Again, it's about putting a plan in place. I mean, we're talking about a data-driven plan that will serve Canadians well toward a vibrant future. And we just don't have that. And again, that was promised at the beginning. We were told that we were going to shut down for 2 weeks, give the government an opportunity to find its bearings, to figure out what was going on, to be able to flatten the curve, and then we were going to come back and put a concrete plan down on paper and then start implementing. Again, 53 weeks later, that still hasn't happened. And so we have those who have small businesses, they're hurting immensely. We have individuals who have lost their jobs. In fact, over 1 million Canadians have lost their jobs during this time. But how the story is worse than that even, and that is to say that the secondary health effects of the pandemic actually have to do with mental health concerns. We're seeing them skyrocket. We're seeing suicide numbers go up. I mean, right now in Canada, every 24 hours, there are 10 people who commit suicide. We're seeing those rates go up dramatically in children. I mean, hell, this is not okay. We are not okay as a country. And Canadians are begging for a concrete data-driven plan that is going to allow us to safely return to normal. Canadians deserve that, and that's what Conservatives are calling for.
So let me ask you something. With everything that's been said and done, and especially now that more of the vaccines are rolling into Canada, do you think perhaps we'll see an election this spring?
Well, hell, look, here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that the Liberals are ramping up spending. I can tell you that the Liberals are really enjoying playing with the data when it comes to vaccines. Most recently, they've said that they're now going to allow for up to 4 months between dose one and dose two, which health officials have warned against. But the reason that the Liberals want to do that is because they want to be able to report back to Canadians how many shots have been put in arms rather than how many Canadians have been fully vaccinated. That number is very different, but they're thinking that it'll make them look good. On top of that, Trudeau is ahead in the polls right now. And of course, that's a prime time for him to call an election. It's sad because he's taking advantage of a situation that puts him ahead in the polls and would allow him to then call an election and potentially be quite successful in that. But it's at the expense of Canadians. They don't want to be dragged out right now when we're in the middle of dealing with a pandemic. They want this government to get to work and solve the real problems that are in front of us.
So it's safe to say that your party doesn't want an election right now?
I think that's safe to say, Hal.
Okay. Now let's talk about Bill C7 for just a moment here, Rachel. The Medical Assistance in Dying Bill, which received royal assent. What are some of your biggest concerns regarding the new MAID bill?
Yeah. Hal, I really appreciate you asking this question because I think it's something that's not getting proper coverage in our nation. This bill will forever change the social fabric of Canada. It will forever change the way that we view life and death. And so Bill C7 expands the legislation around euthanasia. It allows for those who have a mental illness to request euthanasia, and the mental illness can be their sole reason for doing so. Now, that's the result of an amendment that came back from the Senate when it was sent there. But before that amendment was even made, I believe that the bill already went too far, that it failed to protect those with a disability. Ultimately, as legislators, we should be concerned with the most vulnerable. That should be top of mind for us. And unfortunately, this legislation just doesn't do that. In fact, I would say that it makes them further at risk of being, mistreated. We heard compelling testimony from many, many, many witnesses who came forward at committee during the time that this bill was studied, and those witnesses, who had a disability or who had a mental illness, they pleaded with those members of the committee not to go in this direction.
Now, the federal Liberals have been blasting the Tories, your party, over climate change. Did your party recently vote to say at your convention that climate change is not real, as some of the mainstream media has been reporting?
You know how it's interesting because the Liberals have had more than 5 years to put forward a environmental plan, and the most they've been able to come up with is a carbon tax. And then on top of that, during the pandemic, they had the nerve to increase that carbon tax even further. I mean, that's something that's impacting everyday Canadians, whether you're driving your kids to soccer practice or you're driving to work or you're heating your home. Oh my goodness, how dare you heat your home in Canada, for crying out loud? Like, that's what this government's plan is in terms of climate action. Hell, look, at the end of the day, our plan needs to be focused on stewardship. So, as conservatives, yes, we are exactly that. We are conservatives of the environment. So, let's steward it really well. We only have one Earth. Let's take care of it. Let's put, practical steps in place that are going to facilitate a green planet. And I think by that, what I mean largely is we need to partner with industry. I mean, after all, we're talking about some of the most creative minds. We're talking about scientists. We're talking about those individuals who really have practical solutions to the problems we face when it comes to caring for the environment. As conservatives, we believe in bringing them to the table, giving them a voice, and helping us move forward toward a solution.
So your party did not vote to say at the convention that climate change is not real then, in other words?
I think it's important to acknowledge that that was a two-part motion. And so one was acknowledging that climate change is real, and the other part to that motion was talking about how then to solve the problem. And so there were discrepancies in terms of, members within the party had disagreements in terms of how that solution should be rolled out. The vote fell where it fell.
Let me ask you something. Why the Liberals focus so much on climate change when we're still in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic?
How that's a great question. I would argue that the Liberals are more full of talking points than they are any sort of action that would result in real change. For whatever reason, they've chosen that that should be a significant part of their narrative. But when we talk to Canadians, when I talk to those who come into my office or who call my office or who email my office, when I talk to Canadians, when I'm walking down the street here in Ottawa, even, what the issues that are top of mind for them are their family, their loved ones, taking care of their health, their well-being. I don't hear a lot of conversation around the environment these days.
And jobs. I mean, 10,000 restaurants. A new study came out, a new report. More than 10,000 restaurant owners had to close their doors across the country during the pandemic. It is so sad. Rachel, ever since Derek Sloan was punted from the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada caucus, many are concerned about the fate of social conservatives within your party. Now, were some of those concerns addressed at the recent convention?
Yeah, Hal, I think one of the important things to note here is that the Conservative Party of Canada is the only party that allows for diversity of thought. Now, what that means is that, we hold a variety of viewpoints and sometimes we're going to disagree. But you know what, Hell, instead of looking at that as a disadvantage or a weakness, I actually view that as a strength. Because when I look at Canada, I see a country that is pluralistic in nature, a country where we have people from all sorts of backgrounds and walks of life with all sorts of beliefs and values. And, I think the Conservative Party of Canada shows itself to be a place where those individuals can find a political home because we reflect that diversity. And so, yes, sometimes we disagree, but let's learn to disagree without being disagreeable. I think Conservative members are trying our best to do that.
Now, you recently referred to Canada's agriculture sector as Canada's unsung superpower. Now, you say that agriculture and agri-food sectors contribute more than $100 billion to Canada's economy, which runs up to about 7% of our GDP. Rachel, is this the wave of the future, putting more of our eggs into the agribusiness basket? Pun intended?
Great pun, Hal. I certainly believe so. Absolutely. I've talked about this extensively. I believe that agriculture is our way forward. Agri-production, agri-science, agri-tech, agribusiness. Like this is the way of the future. And we happen to be so incredibly blessed in southern Alberta and in particular in Lethbridge because we have all of the necessary ingredients to excel. We have great soil, we have great sun, we have great access to water through irrigation, and we have fantastic talent and labor. And so, with these key ingredients in mind, and available at our fingertips, we really have the ability to drive agriculture forward and to really lead not only within our country, but I would even say on the world stage.
What do you see as some of the most pressing issues here in Lethbridge that we're dealing with? Obviously, COVID-19, the pandemic, a lot of business owners are struggling. But let's also talk about the recent report from Alberta Health Services showing that in 2020, 52 people in our city died from a drug overdose, drug poisoning. And across the South Zone, there were 102 deaths caused by drug use, or a rate of 32.8 per 100,000 people. The provincial average was 28.7 per 100,000 people. So we still have a drug crisis here in our city.
Yeah, and how it's so sad because I think what we have to first do is pause and acknowledge that these individuals are human beings. And they are people who have loved ones most often. And those loved ones are, hugely impacted by the overdose and the potential death that results. And so I think we have to acknowledge that first and foremost. I think the other thing we have to acknowledge is that, most people don't just stumble into a drug addiction. Most people don't choose that as their the thing that they want to engage in most in life. Most people, there's something else that happened that drove them to that. It's usually a coping mechanism for something absolutely devastating that took place. And so, all that to say, I think we have a responsibility then to hold hope out to these individuals, and hope looks like detox. It looks like recovery. It looks like mental health services. It looks like really helping these individuals be restored to a place of dignity and purpose and where they are, able to look at themselves in the mirror and be really proud of who they are and excited about their future. They deserve that.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's talk about federal infrastructure projects for Lethbridge for just a moment. What can we look forward to possibly seeing come down the pipe?
Hal, I wish we could look forward to a whole lot. Unfortunately, this government has promised a ton when it comes to infrastructure, and I would even say that they've spent a ton, or at least they claim to have. They created something called an infrastructure bank for building major infrastructure projects across this country, and they allocated $35 billion to it. But to date, they haven't been able to show evidence of a single project being completed. And so this is a problem across the country, and we certainly see that as a problem in Lethbridge because we really haven't received much in the way of federal funding for infrastructure.
Lethbridge Conservative MP Rachel Harder, thanks for joining me today from Ottawa.
Thank you, Hal, for having me.